This is the second video in a series of 3 dedicated to the creation and customization of scatter and line plots in KIWI Explorer. In this video, I will show how you can use multiple y-axis variables to create a scatter and line plot. And I will also illustrate how you can use a primary and a secondary y-axis to show the data for 2 different typically endpoints. I have opened KIWI Explorer for 2 datasets. The first one is called subset_demo.csv. This is the same data that we've used in the first tutorial on scatter and line plots. The second one is called longform_demo.csv. I will describe its content a little bit later in this tutorial. This page is shown side by side with the profile manager, which I will use again to show the settings that you need to define to achieve the design that I will describe. The first profile in the navigation tree illustrates how you can use multiple y-axis variables and show those variables against the same x-axis variable. So each variable is identified with a different symbol and a different color. So we've got our red for the observation variable, the blue triangle for the M1 variable, and the green X's for the M2 variable. All variables are shown on the same y-axis scale. So to achieve that design, you need to go to the basic settings, and instead of selecting a single y-axis variable, you simply define multiple variables. When you do that and you don't provide any custom label for the y-axis, KIWI will assign a very generic title set to value. So depending on what your different variables represent, in this case it was the parent drug, first metabolite and a second metabolite. So depending on what your variables are, you would need to define something that would describe all your variables in a generic manner. Now, assuming that the scale of your variables were not necessarily compatible, you would need to break the data so that it shows one variable on one y-axis scale and a second variable on a second y-axis scale. So this is what is illustrated in this second profile. We're showing the observation variable, so the DV variable, and the M1 on 2 different y-axes. The left y-axis is the primary y-axis, and it is related to the DV variable or the observation, and the right y-axis is related to M1, and you can see that the scale of the secondary y-axis is different from the scale of the primary y-axis. So with this design you can only see two different variables. You can achieve this design by going to the basic setting. I just want to view that, not modify it. And in the basic settings panel, you select a single y-axis variable in this field, and you select a single variable in the secondary y-axis variable. So this is how you achieve this design. You can click on the secondary y-axis panel to access to the same properties or features to control the label of this secondary y-axis variable, the limits, logarithmic scale, and transformation functions. Depending on the numerical value, you may have to adjust some additional settings. I believe it is in the layout. No, yes it is. Those two variables, or those two settings, the left y-axis padding and right y-axis padding, control the amount of space that exists between the border of the image and the placement of the, in this case, the right y-axis, or the secondary y-axis. In the same way, there is this padding of 3, which is the default, which is kind of a scaling factor. It's not necessarily it doesn't have a unit, but that's the space between the left border of the image and the left, the primary y-axis. So there's a little bit more padding on this side than there is on this side. And sometimes if your numerical values are large, you may need to adjust, either typically bringing using a higher value of the padding to shrink a little bit the plot and allow more space for the axis. You don't have to do that when you're using just a single or multiple y-axis variable. The placement of the left axis is typically pretty good. So this is the way you can use a primary and a secondary y-axis if your data contain multiple variables. So you have a dv variables and a m1 variables. Both variables have been recorded at the same time. Sometimes you have data that were not collected at the same time, and you end up using a different format of your data, a longer format. I'm going to switch to Excel for a second to describe the structure of this second data set. In this second data set, we have reshaped the subset of data for study 1 and dose 10, and we have inserted the concentration of the M1, M2, and M3 as new records in the dataset. And each record is identified by a different value of the SAMP record. So that's the long form of the same data that was contained in subset demo. So in this case, you only have one variable that documents all the endpoint value, and you have an endpoint variable which identifies which records, or which type of endpoint was associated with each record. So coming back to the KIWI Explorer and selecting this dataset and the last profile, this is a very similar view or display of the data. You can see slight differences in the axis title. The title will display observation, which is the label of the dv variable, which is now the only variable that you can use to select your y-axis variable or values. So on the left side you have observation, SAMP equal 1, and on the right side you've got observation, SAMP equal 2. So this design is a little bit more complex and involve more settings. So first off, for this design, I have a slightly different data subset. Still use the study equal 1 and the dose equal 10, but I'm subsetting to the record that have SAMP greater or equal to 1. So I will include all the records with SAMP equal 1, 2, 3, and 4. I'm not necessarily going to use them all, but they are part of the data that is available to the plot. So this is the first thing, slight difference in the data subset. In the basic settings, I have selected an x-axis variable, a y-axis variable, which is the TV variable, but I don't select a secondary y-axis variable. You need to go to the secondary y-axis variable panel and set the value of your endpoint variable. So in my case, the SAMP, the value that corresponds to the primary y-axis. So my SAMP equal 1 record would be displayed on the primary y-axis. And then on the second field, the value of the endpoint variable, or endpoint, yes, the endpoint variable identifying the records displayed on the secondary y-axis variable. So that implies that the profile knows what your endpoint variable is, and this is defined in this is starting to get a little bit busy, so let me rearrange that a little bit. So in the variable definition, you need to define what is the variable that identify your different endpoints. In my case, it was SAMP. Typical variable names for that are DVID, type. Sometimes you can even use the compartment CMT variable from NumM for achieving that distinction between endpoints. So by selecting 1 and 2 here, you break the data into the primary and the secondary y-axis variable. This concludes our presentation of the functionality allowing the display of multiple variables on the y-axis dimension of your scatter and line plots. Thank you very much.